you could be considered retarded. And for children in the 1940s, and especially in the 1950s, that meant being placed in typically the state residential institution. And again, perhaps for the rest of their lives. By identifying something that is autism, which he didn't know what it was, and we still actually don't really know what it is, but over time it acquired the meaning that it is a developmental disability. Therefore, it is neither mental illness nor mental retardation, which implies that there is potential. So already in the 1960s, you see all kinds of reforms, all kinds of attempts to increase the mental health workforce, to provide therapy for other people who needed it, etc. Because when you say perverse incentives, you imply that the professions create their own demand, right? They somehow impart it to people that they need it. But the demand was there. A lot of times it's a grandmother who simply has more experience than the parents and is saying, look, something's wrong here. And the parents say, no. What do you know, grandma? But grandma's right. And sometimes it could be a early childhood worker or somebody like that who calls attention to it. But that is the typical process, actually. So it's not the regressive process. It's a process by which, you have a child who seems to be developing in the right way, but you don't actually know so much. And then it's that thing. Well, where's speech? Where's language? I don't know anything about the Amish, I'm sorry, but I do know a lot about Orthodox Jews, and that's just simply not true. There's plenty of autism cases among Orthodox Jews. I think, it depends about what communities we're talking about and how well they are integrated in the medical system to know to what extent those cases are actually brought to medical attention.
I'm Dr. Randall Bock, and I'm honored today to have with us Professor Gil Eyal from Columbia University, professor of sociology, and we're going to be talking about his work from a decade ago or more, but still pertinent, the autism matrix. Professor Eyal, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, Randall.
Tell us. Everyone, I covered the opioid epidemic, but now there's the autism epidemic. What is the autism epidemic? Is it a biologic epidemic, a semantic epidemic? How different are human beings now, mental neurodivergence from, say, a century ago? Are we noticing things differently? Tell us what we have here.
It's a little bit more complicated than that, either or. But we can start by saying, okay, I don't think we are all that different. So when you say the epidemic, it refers basically to a statistical fact, right? That you have a much larger number of individuals who are diagnosed with autism, especially children with autism. It is not a new phenomenon by now. So you say my book is from 2010. The research started in 2006. I started research in 2006 because, I was hearing a lot about the increasing numbers of diagnosis. And then when I looked a little bit back, I could say, the numbers were starting to increase in the 1980s. So it's not a new phenomenon. There's more attention to it at this particular historical moment, which is why the two of us are talking. But it's a phenomenon of the last 40 years. And, in the book, I connected indeed to the change in diagnostic criteria. I don't think there's any doubt about it because the diagnostic criteria changed really radically. When you look back to 1943, when Tanner originally coined the diagnosis, the 11 children he looked at, and the criteria, it wasn't a criteria, the description of the condition that he gave was a very severe form. in only in 1987 with the DSM-3 revised. It's like that's the not DSM-3 because it's from 1980, but DSM-3 revised from 1987. You get a completely different set of diagnostic criteria. They're a lot more relaxed. They permit a spectrum. And you do see from then on an increase in the number of diagnoses. Um, but are we different people? To some extent, yes, because, people, if, people to some extent um, begin to think about themselves with this new set of categories. Parents start to look at their children with an understanding that this is autism or this is an autistic tendency, and to that extent, we are different people who give different names to maybe uh, conditions and personality characteristics and symptoms that in the past were given other names. So I don't know if I quite answered your question, but we can continue this conversation. You could push
Yeah, no,
push on.
humans are funny. So
Yeah.
there's always going to be kind of the chicken and egg argument, and maybe more like the Heisenberg argument that we alter something by observing it.
Yes.
I think we have far fewer children per couple or per woman than we did, say, 100 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And when you have fewer children, I think you're going to examine those children you have more cautiously, skeptically, and expect more. Um, it's I think both my wife's and
Yeah.
my own grandparents and great grandparents came from much larger broods, and I think there was more infant mortality and manually assist them labor and whatnot. So we have different expectations. I think we're a much more cognitive based society as well. It's not like these terms didn't exist. I was just looking at a 1915 drawing of gradation from, I forget which goes which. I think it's from imbecile to moron to idiot, and those were technical terms.
Yes.
And that was kind of enfeeble-minded and then
Yes.
mentally retarded. We've
Yes.
had terms, and
Mm-hmm.
the lexicon keeps changing. The term autism itself, I think we started around that same time,
Mm-hmm.
early 1910s
Mm-hmm.
by Bloiler,
Yeah.
and it meant something completely 180 degree
Schizophrenia. Yeah.
different from what autism
Yeah.
is now. It was kind of an increase in imagination and so forth, rather than kind of an absence
Mm-hmm.
of kind of this
Yeah.
imaginative aspect. So maybe we could, I don't know if there's some fodder there for you to
Yes,
discuss,
there is.
but we can talk about what it
Yeah.
is and where we've gone with it, and whether any of those,
Yeah.
you're a sociologist, so I'm assuming you're going to
Yeah.
think sociologically,
Yes.
if not logically.
Yes, there's fodder here. So there's a lot of good things in what you said. So you said, we started to think about it differently. We give a different name. We start to think about it differently. In what way differently? This is something that is I guess, the core argument of my book, and where I really push the whole issue of autism beyond the question of diagnostic change. Yes, there's diagnostic change, but why is there diagnostic change, right? You could say we change the diagnosis because we understand autism better, and it's just more accurate. I don't think that's necessarily a very good way to understand it. If you look at the arc of the development of the term, the condition, how it is applied, we give that name increasingly because we think um, there is something more. So the alternative for a lot of, let's say, for the 11 children that Leo Kanner saw in 1943, or actually in the preceding years before that, the alternative was either to say that they suffer from childhood schizophrenia, they're crazy, or, and that meant, by the way, that they would be put, in some kind of an asylum or something like that for the rest of their lives, or to say that they are mentally retarded. And by the way, you're absolutely right about the terms being used. So there is a history in which terms are being invented as euphemisms. Feeble-minded, for example, was a euphemism. Retarded was a euphemism. It was a way of trying to give a term that was nice. It sounded nicer at that time, but it acquired all these ugly connotations later. Yeah, so that was the other option. You could be considered retarded, and for children in the 1940s, and especially in the 1950s, that meant being placed in a residential, uh, typically the state residential institution, and again, perhaps for the rest of their lives. By identifying something that is autism, which he didn't know what it was. And we still actually don't really know what it is. But over time, it acquired the meaning that it is a developmental disability. Therefore, it is neither mental illness nor mental retardation, which implies that there is potential. There is the ability perhaps to intervene very early on and find that potential and increase it. Um, Something that was not considered at the time relevant to the other conditions. Um, and so by saying autism, we are now saying, there is this possibility to treat these children, to identify this very early on. This is why we have early intervention. Um, to bring in We don't have a cure, right? We don't really even know what it is, but to bring in speech therapy, to bring in occupational therapy, to bring in physical therapy, to bring in intensive intervention during what is typically understood to be like a critical window of opportunity in early childhood, and the understanding is like the earlier you intervene, the more payoff could there be. Um, and then and now you can see like why, beyond the diagnostics change, why we have much larger numbers, because it actually is to some extent, you could, when you say an epidemic, you say, oh, something terrible is happening. And I almost want to say that's the opposite, right? It's not something terrible, it's actually something good, because where would those children be otherwise? They would be in state residential institutions for the mentally retarded, or in asylums for children with childhood psychosis, or whatever they called it at the time. And what autism this is why I call the book Autism Matrix. We don't know what it is, and it's a spectrum. So, in fact, it includes people and children of many, many different conditions and situations. But what I do know about it is that it stands for a different way of thinking about the potential of these children, and a different way of intervening, including them, offering them, interventions, etc. There's limitations to that, but it's certainly better than what came before it.
Hmm. So, in your work, were you meeting with children or individuals with these issues? Were you able to kind of categorize who falls under which of these kind of now spectrum disorder names? With the acronyms, there's Asperger's and there's PDD-NOS
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and all these others. I mean, how close did you? I mean, if it's like a fish tank or something like that, how close can you get to the window and identify which thing is which? And do you notice any trends between those? And then as far as the benefits, who's benefiting from what? And is there, and this, I know I'm
Yeah.
giving you 18 questions, but is there a benefit by kind of giving all kinds of labels to all kinds of kids all the time?
Okay, so I did explain the benefit, right? It's the ability to intervene early and to provide those kind of therapies that are, they're kind of general. They're given to kids who are, as you said, PDD-NOS, or they are severely impacted, and they're intensive. They require a lot of work. They're costly as well, but you do get some results out of them. Now, you ask, Can I get to the, close to the aquarium and tell you which is which? No, I'm not the expert on that. There are people who are the experts on that, and I observed them. So, like when I did observations in autism clinic in New Jersey, and there are people there who diagnose autism on a regular basis. A child will come into the room, they will tell you immediately, oh, yes, oh, no, or, yeah, the PDD-NOS. And then, of course, they have to do the whole procedure of the ADOS, the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule, which is like a lot of other medical forms. You check in, and then you total the numbers, but they already kind of knew like where the number is going to fall. So people who do this day in and day out, they have the expertise to identify, to diagnose, to see the differences. But you ask whether this is useful. I think the proof of the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Namely, it's really, really hard to know in advance whether those interventions will be helpful and to what extent. That's actually the beauty of it in some sense, because in the past, clinicians and psychiatrists in particular would look at the kids and they would say, nothing will come out of this kid. Better put them in a state residential institution. And if you will, the kind of the step back that we take today is like we say, we don't know. You can't quite tell. I think once you engage in, let's say, intensive speech therapy, I think within 6 months to a year, you discover, well, how far is this going to go? Yes, I think so. Once you engage in intensive occupational therapy, similarly, you get a sense of how far it's going to go. Yeah, sorry, I interrupted you.
No, it's fine. I mean, I'm a bit of a skeptic about some of these things. In my medical career, I'm old enough to remember when there were no chiropractors. When I say no, I mean it was not zero, but there was not the same number of chiropractors we have today. It's a slightly different topic.
Yes.
But there were no real physical therapists. Yeah. But they kind of emanated. It's really worth an article of its own. But when they changed car insurance to no fault, everybody could sue when they had an accident. And so in order to differentiate the severe from the not, they made a rule. They said, look, not everyone's going to be able to collect, a cash payout from an accident. You're going to have, I'm doing Dr. Evil, you're going to have like $1,000 of medical bills to prove you're serious. Well, humans, they take a situation, they can invert it. And all of a sudden, there was a whole physical therapy and chiropractor industry be able to generate $1,000 sum of visits, daily over 2 weeks. And then now you had your what's called the PIP, the personal injury payment payout portion, and you're off to the races. So since then, there's a huge number of physical therapy, and people that have the car accidents, they go to physical therapists. They go, oh, no. Now, are they better off people? Are the accidents much more severe now? We have a huge increase in payouts on car accidents, but yet cars are safer. The street lights are better. There's noise, there's walk signals, all kinds of things that weren't, didn't really exist, say, 50 years ago, whatnot. So the whole industry surrounding has been very good for the chiropractors, very good for the physical therapists. What do you think about any kind of, well, I hate to use the word perverse, but perverse incentives that exist within the autism diagnosis explosion, increase? I don't know what the right word is.
Yeah. Let me just recall the whole context of your question. You expressed certain kind of skepticism because I said, look, to some extent, the reason why we have autism as these larger numbers is because of the fact that this diagnosis does open up the opportunity to think the child has potential. The potential can be addressed with early intervention, occupational therapy, speech therapy, etc. At which point you were skeptical. And I said, and I will say first, I'm not surprised that you're skeptical, because doctors typically are skeptical of the therapies, the therapies are not medical, right? They're not, they're not based on medical knowledge. So skepticism is understandable. And then, of course, you also raised the possibility of perverse incentives. You said, okay, they're benefiting to some extent. But there's more to that. First, I would say let's look back to when did we start to have the growth of speech therapy and occupational therapy. I mean, those date from early 20th century, but what is called the therapeutic revolution, the broad growth of those therapies and others, dates from the early 1970s. And one very important context is obviously deinstitutionalization, both of people who were mentally ill and of people who were in institutions for the mentally retarded, especially children. The question is like, what do you do with them? And then the other very important context, which is still true today, is that medicine, and in particular in this case, psychiatry, simply doesn't have the numbers. It is so below the numbers of what the American population needs in terms of healthcare needs, and in this case, mental health or developmental disability needs, etc. It's just not enough. So already in the 1960s, you see all kinds of reforms, all kinds of attempts to increase the mental health workforce in the form of community mental health clinics, in the form of training, mothers in the suburbs to provide therapy for other people who needed it, etc. And so there was demand. It's not necessarily the case that those, because when you say perverse incentives, you imply that the professions create their own demand, right? They somehow impart it to people that they need it, but the demand was there.
Well, to just
Yeah,
interrupt slightly, it can cut both ways. I mean, there can be an incentive for, like, one of my fields is the opioid
yeah,
epidemic and so forth. There can be an incentive for both parties at a methadone clinic. The methadone clinic gets to be employed,
yeah,
and they get to
yeah,
have a
yeah.
customer forever.
Hmm.
It's even more secure job than
Yeah,
Starbucks, which is also dealing with an addictive substance, but they can go anywhere. But the methadone clinic pretty much owns its own
hmm,
clients. So they benefit clearly. And then the narcotic addict might benefit because he's got a free supply of narcotics he used to have to pay for. He may have no interest in going through cold turkey and having the symptoms or whatever for a few weeks or a month or whatever in order to get completely sober. And so he benefits. So they're both benefiting. In this case, I think there are some clear benefits to a parent who has an apparent child of this type, um, and having the solace and somebody listening and so forth. I'm not going to say that they're not both benefiting, but they could be both benefiting at somebody else's expense who's paying for this. Again,
yeah,
I
yeah,
walked the earth in the Paleozoic
yeah.
age, and I went to public school in New York City, and we had back at PS 81 in 1960s when I was there, we had a principal, an assistant principal, a nurse, um, secretary, and a few janitors, and then they were just
Mhm.
teachers, and that was
Yeah.
it. If you look at the
Hmm.
roster of a school today, there are more ancillary service people than there are teachers. So this has grown to like 60% of the school roster at all our public schools are other things. Now, some of them are English as a second language and this and that, but some of it's occupational therapists, in middle school or elementary school, and some of it is all the special eds and people shadowing the kids. So have we deinstitutionalized but reinstitutionalized?
Well, no, I don't think I wouldn't call that reinstitutionalization. There's a big difference.
Well, I mean, it's in a different institution. We might have the workforce of the institutions and have them, decentralized and spread out, so everybody's kind of seeing it. I mean, we could, ask the same question about, schizophrenic types who are potentially amongst the homeless, but that's another
That's a
topic,
different
another
topic.
day.
Look, I mean, no, I wouldn't call it reinstitutionalization because that would undermine. I mean, not undermine. It just doesn't give you a good understanding of what was institutionalization in the past. All the accounts that we have is a lot of neglect. There was very few staff, indeed, in those state residential institutions, and the kids were neglected. And when they were neglected, whatever problems they had just got amplified, right? Um, in the fact that you have those therapies available, and they're not all that available. There's still a shortage, but that they're available to some extent, either through early intervention programs provided by states or municipalities, or in the schools. That's, you could say, yes, it's a form of integration. It's a form of integration of these kids in settings that they would not have been able to be integrated in otherwise. I think that's a good thing. I really think it's a good thing. And it's still limited to some extent. One more argument, one more point about the therapists. And I'm not discounting the 2 points actually. I'm not discounting the points that obviously there are certain incentives both for parents and for the therapists. But let's remember this thing. This is really hard work. It's hard work for not a lot of pay. It's not the case that, occupational therapists or speech therapists are highly paid. They're not highly paid. And doing something like applied behavior analysis, for example, which is the most used therapy for children with autism, that is really grueling work because it's essentially training over and over again. Let's say verbal behavior, like teaching language, over and over again for hours. And then the parents have to do it. The parents watch and then they have to do it. So yes, they have incentives, but this is really tough. I do take into I do think that you are right though to make a point about, but who loses out of that? And there are people who lose out of that. So there, first of all, there are the extreme cases where you have, let's say, a rural school district in which there is a child that requires, intensive intervention, and the parents sue the school district and win, and then the school district says, you know what, that now, since everything has to go to this child, we cannot provide those services and those services and those services to other children.
Right.
Those things do happen. I gave the extreme case. It happens in New York City, not in that extreme way, but it's a matter of resources, and it's a question of like how much of resources do we want to dedicate, to special education? And lots of people will argue we have not dedicated enough, but that's one possibility. The other is the fact that, as I said, and maybe I didn't make the case clear enough, so let me be clear. We have today much larger numbers of children diagnosed with autism because we're not diagnosing them with retardation or intellectual disability. It was the deinstitutionalization of mental retardation that started the process. In the book, I provide some evidence for that. Um, but there are still kids who are diagnosed today with intellectual disability and not with autism. And by the way, they turn out to be mostly poor or minority kids because their parents did not have the wherewithal to advocate for them. Um, they get shafted because the resources and the amount of therapy don't get to them to the same extent. And finally, the very same kids that were provided, the intervention and the intensive therapies, we abandoned them at age 18 or maybe 2 years later. When they graduate out of high school and they get out of the educational system where there's legislation that is, guarantees that they will be provided with the services, then they're abandoned to the patchwork system that is very similar, basically, of how we treat intellectual disability anyway. And then resources don't go to them because, it's a lot easier to get resources flowing to children about whom we believe they have potential. It's a lot harder than to divert to get them flowing to adults, which about whom we say,
Right.
well, this is as much as they will be able to do. Yeah.
Right. So, there's an old expression, everyone talks about the weather, but nobody does anything about it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I don't know if I can maybe stretch that analogy um, to kind of this therapy. This, if we're talking about something that is, say, almost, I mean, it's an analogy, but it's almost literally true, hardwired into the brain, of the way people are going to act and react, and to stimuli and manage their lives or not manage their lives. How much is this therapy? Let's just an applique layer. Now, I will grant that an institution is not a nice and friendly place. Again, back in the Paleozoic, when I was a youngster, and even into medical school, we went to institutions in medical school to look at them, and I don't think they exist to the same extent. All well and good, fine.
True.
But on the other hand, there are many societies that don't have the kind of layers and the kind of the caring and the cushioning, if you will, or the cajoling and the solacing that we have here. And you're talking about into adulthood and beyond. Well, I looked up autism through Google Trends for other places. So, do people look up the word autism in Africa? No. There's basically all through the countries of Africa. You can pick Ghana, Nigeria. I tried to do places that spoke English, and you put in the word autism. Like, is that a searched word? Autistic, autism, and it's not. It doesn't register. There's nothing written on the diagnosis of autism for probably, I don't know what fraction is. Let's say half the world's population. This is a rough estimate. And so where we see autism is where we see kind of Western civilization, as it were. You can call it, Asian civilization, whatever. Where places where they have, say, trams and subways and buses and whatnot. And places where they don't, we don't seem to, look at autism. Now, I'm thinking, well, maybe those societies are more agrarian or labor intensive, and does it matter? Like, I'm not looking forward to doing that kind of work myself, but somebody's going to be doing, kind of the labor that is accruent to kind of more primitive societies, if you will. And does it really matter? Is it that they don't care, they're not looking, or and they probably don't have the institutions either where they're putting people away? So has anybody kind of bridged that gap of what is going on in other places? We care a lot about autism. I never heard the word when I was growing up. I did hear the word mentally retarded and whatnot. How much of these things are a fact and a matter of the types of tasks we have for people to do, which have to be much more complicated. We live in a world where you have to, ostensibly know how to, navigate yourself, although GPS helps. You have to kind of ostensibly be able to do your taxes and figure life out and deal with threats and manage your whatever. There's a whole political, personal economy to being an adult in our societies that you may not have to do in, say, I don't know, rural Uganda.
First of all, people have written about this, so I highly recommend a book by Richard Grinker, who's an anthropologist and also the father of a child with autism, and he has went to India and a few other places. I don't remember all of them, to look at the conditions there. I also had a PhD student of mine who studied autism in Morocco. And he's, by the way, he's a physician now. So, he's combining those both sociology and medicine. So what I would say is this. Look, I mean, there's definitely a grain of truth in what you were saying, right? It is definitely the case that individuals with a variety of developmental disabilities and maybe intellectual disability in the past, in a simpler society where, as you said, the tasks may be simple, perhaps they don't need to read and write in order to be integrated in a society, then they will be they will be below the threshold of medical attention, et cetera, et cetera. We're not there anymore, and what we call the undeveloped world or the developing world is not there anymore either. So, yes, Africa, India, etc. There's still a lot of agriculture, but those societies are urbanizing. It's no longer the case where you could say individual can thrive, without some of the things that we expect in a modern society. Now, beyond that, also. The fact that you don't hear as much about autism in those countries. And by the way, I don't think that's as true anymore anyway. But you can interpret it as saying, um, it's because there's something that modern society is doing to us. It's creating those conditions, or you could say, and there's a little bit of that, I would say, but also you could say. It's simply those individuals are not taken care of, not treated, they are ignored, um, they suffer in those non-modern societies that you were describing, and that is definitely the case. You read Richard Kinker's book, and you realize, yes, there's a lot. I mean, to have a child who is not capable of communicating, is not capable of interacting in a society, in a traditional society. That's a stigma. Often the mother remains completely alone with that child because that's the only person who would interact and would take care of them. That the mother is exposed to the stigma as well. Why did you bring, whatever you brought to us, to our family, etc. This is all stories from places like India or Africa or Morocco, etc. But I should also say, those societies are urbanizing, those societies are developing, those societies are modernizing. This is not the same issues that we have, they have as well.
I'm wondering what fraction of the, say, increasing number of cases of autism you would attribute, whether you can from your purchase sociologist, to what's been talked about, kind of environmental aspects, whether there are toxins out there, whether it's vaccine related, whatever. I do think that the brain can be changed post birth. Some people think genetic, determinism for autism, has everything kind of baked in the cake by the time you are embryologically formed or shortly thereafter in the fetal phase. Do you ascribe to any of the kind of concepts of regression that is happening that people think is going on? You were pointing out that there's greater development of, I guess, developmental observation currently than there ever has been. And that's supposedly one of the benefits of having this kind of early warning system detection, greater diagnosis. So what is this thing we're seeing and hearing about?
Yeah. Look, as I said, I'm a sociologist, so you said that. So I'm not an expert on causation. I can tell you what I know from reading, from looking at the statistics, and also, I mean, I did do some recent research with a few other people on who and how gets diagnosed with autism, and so you asked about, first of all, you asked about their cases of regressive autism. And just for the benefit of the listeners, what Randy meant is cases where a child, where parents report that a child has been, developing regularly, and then somehow um, at 1.5 years or 2 years or something happens, and skills and abilities that they had before disappear. And there's nothing that could be more heartbreaking than that. Um, I have 3 children. Luckily, they're all fine, but I can just imagine, how heartbreaking that is. What I know about regressive autism is that it is relatively rare. From the research that we've done in terms of like what is the typical, if you will, process by which kids get diagnosed with autism. The typical process is not regressive. And I also have a colleague who did, much larger scale research than I did using the administrative records of the California Department of Developmental Disabilities. And there too, regressive autism is a very small portion of the whole thing. The typical process is that sometime around the age of 2, parents recognize that the child is not speaking. And that is the main thing. Um, I say parents, but it's not necessarily parents. A lot of times it's a grandmother who simply has more experience than the parent and is saying, look, something's wrong here. And the parents say, no, no, no. What do you know, grandma? But grandma's right. And sometimes it could be a early childhood worker or somebody like that who calls attention to it. But that is the typical process, actually. So it's not the regressive process. It's a process by which, you have a child who um, seems to be developing in the right way, but you don't actually know so much. And then it's that thing. Well, where's speech? Where's language? Um, and that leads typically to intensive intervention, speech therapy from age 2, 3, 4, whenever the intervention is done. So in terms of what does it tell us, right? Um, at age 2, you cannot tell if this was genetic or something else. No, I don't think you can tell. The prevailing hypothesis is that autism is genetic. What they show is that um, it is correlated with a very, very large number of gene mutations, but the contribution of any of these mutations to the full population of people with autism, any mutation is very small. Now, how do you interpret that? There's a variety of ways to interpret that. You could say it's not, you need the involvement of a lot of different genes, perhaps. You could also interpret that and say autism is really not one thing. It's many, many, many different things. And we have some evidence of that in the sense that there are today, and this is a phenomenon that begins, maybe in the 1960s, but really takes off in the 2000s. There are today a lot of conditions that are defined by a mutation. They are not autism or mental retardation or something like that. They are defined as a mutation in, on this particular chromosome, on this particular area, a particular snap, or something like that. Those conditions often report as one of the symptoms autism, or a variety of symptoms that are similar to that. So you can ask yourself now if autism is one thing, or is kind of like, as I said, a matrix under which we brought together many, many different things. Now, some of those things are clearly genetic, but even if they're genetic, it doesn't mean that they cannot increase over time. There's a variety of factors that could do that. Increasing age of parents, for example, right? Increasing age of parents increases the likelihood of mutations. There's some evidence of that relationship. Increased age of fathers, more mutations, more autism diagnosis, or something like that. Um, I don't think it captures the whole phenomenon because, as I said, the whole phenomenon has to do with also diagnostic change. And there's definitely a lot of children who in the past would not have been diagnosed with autism, but due to diagnostic change are diagnosed with autism. So you were asking about the composition, I think, of the autism population and what are the causes for that. I think regressive autism is a very, very small portion of that. Now, what's the role of environmental pollution? I can't tell you. I don't know. Um, the story about gene what is called gene first conditions and their correlation with autism, they also could increase as a result of environmental pollution. That's quite possible. I don't think anybody knows the answer to that.
So I'm going to segue slightly to maybe more of your sociologic home. Steve Kirsch, I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's the inventor, partial, maybe entire inventor of the optical mouse, and he's made a nice career as an engineer, software, hardware, I guess, maybe, whatever. And he's pointed out numerous times that you don't really see autism amongst Orthodox Jews and the Amish. And ever since COVID, he's been somewhat activated. I think COVID was I don't want to get too far into that, but I think it's a real virus and all that. But I think it was the response was an overkill, and the way the population was kind of kept naive to the illness. I think I don't know. It has aspects that were not really past the sniff test for me. Anyway, but along the lines of his work, he's noticed that there are really no autism diagnoses in the Amish and the Orthodox Jews. So I don't know if you're familiar with that phenomenon, or if so, you want to address it, or if you're not familiar with it, you want to address it anyway. But what's up with that?
Yeah,
Are we
I can
noticing? Is
address it.
that just a kind of different societal?
I
Yeah.
don't know anything about the Amish, I'm sorry, but I do know a lot about Orthodox Jews, and that's just simply not true. There's plenty of autism cases among Orthodox Jews. I think it depends about what communities we're talking about and how well they are integrated in the medical system to know to what extent those cases are actually brought to medical attention. But I'm from Israel, and I go back every year. I wrote the book about autism, particularly in the United States, but there's a chapter also that does comparisons across countries. And I was always interested in the question of autism in Israel. So I know the stats there. I've read studies. There's plenty autism among Orthodox Jewish communities. So I don't know where this is coming from. It might be coming from very simple situation in which you have, let's say, a fairly isolated Hasidic community that doesn't really interact all that much with the medical system. It's just not going to bring its kids to be diagnosed with autism. So I
Right.
understand, that what the implication is. Oh, maybe they do not vaccinate or something like that. But to me, the much easier hypothesis, and I should preface this by saying it is not the case for Orthodox Jews. Maybe there's particular communities that are very isolated, but even in those cases, the easiest, the easier hypothesis, the hypothesis that is more, uh, you know, uh, makes more sense, is simply that they don't bring the kids to medical attention because they don't interact actually with educational authorities, with medical authorities to a large extent.
Well, it could also be they're having kids at a younger age, but that wouldn't explain everything. And again, task matching, how much things get diagnosed based on what types of things people are doing. Now, I know some Orthodox Jews here, and some of them lead very complicated, computer-oriented lives, and they need various social skills and whatnot. So there's all different types of community. I mean, the Amish, is pretty much an agrarian society. I don't think, use electricity, um, through wires and whatnot. And um, so I think that it's not going to be an exact parallel. But yes, Steve Kirsch's point is whether those are communities that have abjured from vaccination. Um, so I guess as far as I want to. I have not read your book in full. I'm just curious what kind of things you'd like to. We have about 5 minutes left or so, maybe 10. Um, what kind of things else you'd like people to know about your work there, and what kind of things they can benefit from, our audience and whatnot, in terms of, I don't know, prevention, I guess. That's kind of maybe a forlorn thought, but as far as other aspects of these growing diagnoses, and I guess my own little secondary question I'll put in as an Easter egg here, is if there's, from what I've seen, I mean, there's huge blossoming, if you will, or social contagion, if different term, of sexual issues, gender dysmorphia, whatever you want to call that, and how much overlap there is with this neurodivergent subset of our populations. In Britain, I think half of the population kind of claims neurodivergence, or people think that, and here it's up to 19% and so forth. It seems like there's a little bit of like perverse or reverse cachet of having certain diagnoses. Whether you're to excuse some of your maybe deficiencies at work. I have dyslexia.
Mm-hmm.
I deficiencies in the social scene. I have Asperger's. Whatever. It seems like maybe there's a little bit of kind of garnering, victim aggrandizement or victim, I guess, reversal.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, I don't know
Yeah.
if you want to pick up any of those topics.
Yeah. Look, I mean, the context. I think the context for our conversation was the fact that RFK sort of started, rekindled, the interest in the autism epidemic. And when he did that, and he said those things about kids who will never, be able to have a job or something like that, there was a lot of noise, a lot of unhappiness from the people who are on the spectrum but are perhaps more functioning, and they said that's stigmatizing, that doesn't represent us. And then there was a very moving letter by a mother in the New York Times who says, I normally don't agree with RFK, but this is my reality. I have two children, with very severe autism, and yes, they're never going to hold a job. They can't speak, you know.
Well, that's clearly the case for some. I mean,
Yeah,
that's I've seen many different
yeah.
kids and now adolescents and whatnot who have severe. They're going to be living with somebody. They're not going to be having their own apartment or gallivanting around
Hmm.
the country backpacking or whatever.
Yeah. No, but the point is this. When I wrote the book in 2010, I included a segment exactly about this issue, and I hoped that it would have some effect, but it didn't. But that's what it is. You write a book and you don't necessarily have that. And the point was this: the autism world already in 2010 was split to some extent between what you might call the neurodivergent, the people on the spectrum, people with Asperger, who are more high functioning, and most importantly, they are self advocates. They say, don't speak for us, we speak for ourselves. We are not sick, we have just a different way of being. And then on the other side are parents of children with very severe autism. And it's clearly the case that you could see a conflict here. But what I try to say in the book is that it's not only a conflict. The two sides actually can see that they have something in common that is useful for both of them. First, the self advocates would have never been where they are today without the parents. It was the parents of children with severe autism that first created the associations, that first created, the understanding that autism, is something that may, is individuals for whom there is more potential than what you immediately see, and they are the ones who offered their organizations and the public perch that they had to the self advocates. So, a person like Temple Grandin, for example, who's famous as a self advocate, first time she could speak to a large public was in a parents organization. So it was those organizations. After all, Autism Speaks, which is the largest organization with the most resources, is still a parents organization. So they have something to give to the self advocates. There's a and then on the other hand, parents of children with severe autism, even severe, they get something from the self advocates, which is self advocates teach us, the rest of us, is that even when you see somebody who is very strange, or perhaps even seems to be unable to communicate, there is somebody behind the mask of autism, and there is maybe a possibility to communicate with them. So even like children with severe autism, certain kinds of therapies develop ways for them to communicate. Let's say picture exchange systems. So children who in the past would have been in a complete disconnect from the world are able to go to the picture exchange system, pick up, like let's say a cup of juice, a picture of a cup of juice, and bring it to the parents and say, look, this is what I want, right? And they're able to communicate. There's things that are a bit more sophisticated than that, like iPads, etc. But the ability to make the claim that a child who is so severely impacted, there is still something there that is, that is a potential for communication is supported by the fact that you have other people on the spectrum who show you that. So the two sides need one another. They're not just in conflict. They could benefit from one another. That's what I tried to say in 2010. Clearly, clearly we are now in the middle of a conflict over this. But I do hope that that what the two have in common can overcome what separates them. Now, you asked also about the gender dysmorphia. I'm not an expert on this. I do know that there is, in recent years, there is a tendency to find a correlation uh, um, uh, for girls with gender dysmorphia also being on the spectrum. This is I've seen that. I've seen reports on that. I've seen articles on that. Um, I mean, you can think about it as two ways of um, not fitting in and carving a different place in the world for yourself. Because you did say something about like finding an excuse, but I think it's a lot more than an excuse. It's finding a meaning, a meaning in the diagnosis, and a place for yourself in the world, which otherwise would be a lot harder.
Well, I thank you for that. I will give you a chance for kind of final words. I don't have quite the same kind of take or vocabulary on this topic as you do, and I'm very much appreciative of your knowledge and perspective on this as I try to craft my own kind of answer. I'm kind of coming upon this as like a blind man in a hotel room, so I'm bumping into certain things. I'm trying to get the landscape of what is out there because I've not been an autism expert by any means. I've been a physician for decades, and I again grew up. I've known family, kind of not direct, but distant family members and cousins twice removed, that kind of thing with diagnoses. I have friends with kids who are some are severely autistic and whatnot. So I see it out there. I've been looking for like the quote unquote answer to try to get a perspective of how much of this is a new development. That's just kind of my approach on it. So I'm happy to learn some of the other aspects of it. So, kind of the benefit side to earlier diagnosis and whatnot. And I'm very much in your debt for having spent the time with me today to do that. So I don't know if you'd like to give any final words for our audience on this topic. And people can find your book, The Autism Matrix, easy to spell and pronounce. And I guess I have one, another Easter egg question. Down syndrome, trisomy 21, is mental retardation. Is there anybody out there who's currently mentally retarded, as it were? Is that something that's even said anymore? And if somebody had trisomy 21 and is Down syndrome and mentally, I don't know, whatever, not going to be able to achieve, intellectually challenged, whatever you want to call it today, is that person also autistic?
No, I think that's in the case of Down syndrome. I mean, I think the overlap is minuscule, minimal, does not exist. I may be wrong. I may be missing a few, but nobody has ever suggested that there is overlap, and it's quite obvious why. I mean, the trisomy 21 is a very clear and large, mutation in the chromosome. There's no reason why that would overlap with autism. On the other hand, the I think the second most, in terms of numbers, the second most well-known and in terms of number condition of intellectual disability, Fragile X, has a lot of overlap with autism, um, and and that just supports the idea that in fact those children in the past would have very likely have found themselves in state institutions. Now you asked me if and I wanted to thank you, Randy. It's also very important that you are having, you're bringing attention to the issue of autism. And so I wanted to thank you for inviting me and getting the chance to talk about this. And you gave me the chance to like finish with something. So I just wanted to say, autism came back to the conversation, but for the wrong reason, I think. Came back to the conversation over the question of like, what's causing it? And I think you got a sense, and in our conversation, and I'll say it now also more clearly, I don't think autism is one thing. I think it's a lot of different things that are brought together by a variety of reasons. And those reasons I don't think are bad. I think they're actually good reasons. But for that reason, the main question I don't think should be like, what causes it? Because there are many, many, many different causes, and we're going to chip away at them over time. The far more important question is like, what do we do about it? How do we help, the children and the parents and the families, who are dealing with this condition? And yes, I also agree, I think, with the implied sense that you had, and with the letter from the mother that I mentioned in the New York Times. It's like, yes, when we are saying, what do we do about it? There are people who require more help, and there are children who require more help, and we should direct resources at them.
Well, thank you so much. That's been Professor Gil Eyal.